Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's Food for Thought breakfast. This event is hosted by the European Union Office of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints here in Brussels, Belgium. It is entitled Ahead of the G20 Interfaith Summit, Religion, Development, and the Refugee Crisis on the EU Agenda. This panel is being live streamed on our Facebook and YouTube channels as well. The impact of interfaith summits has been acknowledged by G8 leaders in the past and G20 leaders today. The G20 countries account for more than 4/5 of gross world product and 3/4 of global trade and are home to almost 2/3 of the world's population. It is therefore important to create a reliable and resourceful channel to convey the religious perspective to today's complex issues. The aim of our Food for Thought breakfast discussion today is to touch on the main themes of this year's G20 Interfaith Summit in Berlin, Germany, later this month. During the summit, special attention will be paid to the refugee crisis, religious extremism, and other issues such as the environment, where religious voices have much to contribute. We hope the presentations from our distinguished guests and speakers today and the discussion with you here and those watching online will generate ideas that will be further developed in Berlin. I'm honored to introduce Dr. Pasquale Annicchino, a Senior Research Fellow at the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation. He is also a Research Fellow at the European University Institute and Senior Research Associate at the Cambridge Institute on Religion and International Studies at Cambridge University. He is also a member of the Italian Council for the Relationships with Muslim Communities at the Italian Ministry of Interior. Dr. David Kirkham, Academic Director and a Political Science Professor at Brigham Young University London Centre. He is also a Senior Fellow for Comparative Law and International Policy at Brigham Young University Law School International Center for Law and Religion Studies. And finally, Mr. Fearghas, Advisor to the European Parliament Vice President and Secretary General. Their bios are included in your folder here and are also posted on this events page on our Facebook channel. They will speak in this order, as I just mentioned, and each of them will focus on one or more of the summit's sub-themes, which are the links between economic development and religious freedom, the constructive dialogue between leaders of multiple sectors in society, on how faith can help to enhance social, economic, and cultural policies and programs for the well-being of all, demystifying and fostering communication channels between different faiths, ideas, experiences, and best practices in building peace and harmony, and finally, common values, virtues, and principles among diverse faith and philosophical traditions. Following their presentations, the floor will be open for questions and an open discussion. Those watching online may submit their questions by leaving a comment on our Facebook page, and we invite you to do so. A link is also shown on your screen. So without further delay, Dr. Annicchino, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody, and also to all the people that are following this event on social media. Before I start, let me use 1 minute of my 12 remaining minutes just to thank the Latter-day Saints European Union Office and Francesco for inviting me, and let me express my gratitude for the work that you do here in Brussels, because I think that all the people that work in this field, either from the policy side or more from the academia, can appreciate the amount of work that the office has done over the past few years and the contribution. There's a contribution that goes beyond the contribution of the Latter-day Saints as well, but it's a contribution for all the religious communities that work with the European institutions and for the institutions themselves. So therefore, thank you very much, Francesco, for what you do. Thank you very much to all the people that work with you here in Brussels. It's a great pleasure to be back here, because this is the second event which I attend, organized by the office, and where I present something. And the topic of today is, there is no need to stress that, is very, very important and very central to the public debate that we are having now, because the topics that you have listed here are the main topics of discussion for the next G20, which will be held in Germany, as we know, and as you mentioned before. Now, I will focus my remarks on two of the lines of research or thought that you have stressed. And of course, the first, given also the work that has been done by the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation, is the supposed links between religious liberty and economic development. Now, there is a lot of debate on religious freedom globally. First of all, there is a theoretical debate. What is religious freedom? How do we define religious freedom? And then third, what is the contribution that religious freedom makes to society? These are contested issues in many places. Internally, in single countries, in the United States, there is a big debate on what religious freedom entails and what is the scope of this right. And this is true not only for the United States, but also for European countries. And the usual debate about religious freedom that we have seen between policymakers, academia, and all the people that participate into this debate is usually focused on one single question: how do we make use of public institutions to foster the right and the protection of religious freedom? So usually everything is centered on the role of the state to protect freedom of religion belief. But paradoxically enough, often is the state that violates religious freedom. And I think that side of the question is a little bit under-investigated. In the interaction between religion and specifically religious freedom. So here I'm talking only about religious freedom, not religion as such, because from the point of view of the academic literature, there are two different sets of academic literatures. There is one side of the academic literature, mainly produced by economists, that really focuses on religion and economic development. What is the contribution that religious groups can make to economic development? That is one set of the literature. And then there is a new set of the literature which is focused specifically on religious freedom and economic development. And the conclusion and the question of these two different sets of literature are a little bit different. So what do recent studies suggest on the interaction between religious freedom and economic development? Recent studies suggest that society with a high level of protection of generally civil rights and also religious freedom as a civil right have stronger civil societies and perform better economically. So far, no direct causation has been found between the protection of religious freedom and better economic performance. But these studies suggest that the correlation is very likely. I'm referring here especially to the last article published by Brigham and co-authors on the Journal for the Interdisciplinary Studies of Religion. Religious freedom is found to promote economic advancement by boosting other freedoms that are essential to economic development. Where religious freedom is respected, people find it more natural to respect political, artistic, and social freedoms. This is a basic reason why international freedom rankings are highly correlated. Countries with high level of religious freedom have high level of political freedom and vice versa. Religious freedom advances economic development by making people comfortable with diversity of opinion, the expression of new ideas, and challenges to vested interests. As Anthony Gill and John Owen have put in an article published by the Cato Law Journal, religious liberty is not the only factor responsible for economic growth, but it is an important ingredient that makes the economic pie larger and all the more sweet. The idea that individuals holding different beliefs should be tolerated in society, and the incentive of these individuals to promote institutions that allow them to organize and worship freely contribute greatly to an environment that promotes a wide variety of civil liberties, and that concurrently facilitate a number of secular relationships, which in turn promote greater interaction among people. So, what Anthony Gill, which is one of the most important experts, especially on the history of religious freedom, is suggesting is that when you protect religious liberty, you not only protect religious values and religious liberty as such, you also promote and protect secular goods and secular values. And I mean, if you look at this historically, you can clearly see that this is what happened if we think of the history of Europe, and we see how religious dissidents have gone from one country to another, and now those countries that promoted religious liberty have flourished. There are people from the UK here, I would assume there are people from the Netherlands. Look at the history of those countries, and you see how they have performed better, not only in matter of religious liberty, but also in matter of economic growth. And if you look at the studies that now are being published, you see that the correlation between these two issues becomes stronger and stronger. Now, of course, this protection of religious liberty is mainly entailed, as I said before in my introduction, to enactment of laws, enacting a new Bill of Rights, and so on. So there is, of course, a role that public institutions have to play. But religious liberty is also promoted from bottom up and not only top down. And the same can be said for economic development. You don't expect public institutions and the state to create better economic growth, or only the state to create better economic growth. You don't want to centralize all the resources in the hand of states, because usually when you do that, you know that it's not going to end up well. And therefore, what is needed is also, a more bottom-up structure to promote religious freedom and economic development as well. And here, I just want to make a few remarks on the fifth point on our agenda, which is the point on common values, virtues, and principles among different faith and philosophic tradition, because it's exactly the contribution that religious groups can make. And here, you can rely on a lot of theological text as well. I think about, for instance, the role as a Catholic, the role that Catholic social doctrine has played in advancing certain understanding of the good society and moderating certain totalitarian instinct as well. And therefore, if the question is, should religious liberty have a role, and the common values among religious groups have a role in promoting better understanding among religious groups, and also better understanding of secular values and economic development? Yes, and this is happening on a global scale, because we constantly see interfaith meetings trying to advance common goals and common cause. The final thing I want to stress, because I'm approaching my last minute, is that besides religious group, there needs to be also a role for businesses and enterprises. We are seeing this with the work that the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation is doing. In certain parts of the world, you simply have non-functioning public institutions that can advance these goals. Therefore, what you really need is a strong civil society, strong economic actors, and when you are able to combine strong civil society and strong economic actors, you are going to achieve better goals than only focusing on the role of the state. I will stop here, looking forward to further discuss with you in the Q&A session, and thank you very much again for having me today.
Thank you very much, Pasquale, for your presentation. David.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I too would like to thank Francesco and his office for the opportunity to be engaged in this exciting initiative, and also to thank Pasquale for laying a strong foundation for the discussion. I will take a different approach from him and focus on different sub-themes of the agenda. A number of years ago, about 1999, in fact, I had the privilege of chairing a high-level conference for the United Nations in West Africa with the Economic Organization for West African States. And the idea was to bring these people together to try and encourage them to use their military assets for humanitarian purposes, to beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks in a way. At the beginning of the conference, well, after we'd been debating for a couple of hours, a woman stood up. She was the high-ranking leader of an NGO in Sierra Leone. And she said to me, I've been watching with interest what the United Nations and Europeans have done in Kosovo with the refugee crisis. It's very impressive. She said, now we here in Sierra Leone have just gone through 10 years of a horrific civil war. We have 500,000 refugees outside our borders. We have children who have gone 10 years without an education. And she described the horrors that were created by Fodo Sanko and his revolutionary rebels, and everything from creating child soldiers, drugging them, forcing them to kill their parents, the dismembering of people's limbs, right down to very small children. And then she said to me, to me, because I was sharing. I wish it hadn't been to me, I suppose. She said, what's it going to take for the United Nations and the Western nations to pay as much attention to Sierra Leone as they've just paid to Kosovo? My first response, or my first thought anyway, didn't say it, was what's an obscure boy like me from Farmington, Utah, sitting here having to answer that kind of question for the United Nations? Well, I might ask today, what's it going to take to achieve a world in which people are respected for their beliefs in all their varieties, and in which violence in the name of faith or religion becomes unimaginable? It's a pretty high standard. I try to think of other historical precedents where maybe something great has come in the way of human rights and so forth, and asking myself, it was born out of what? The one that comes to my mind primarily is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we all know was a result of the Second World War. That's a pretty bad, when I say what's it going to take for the world to really come up with something like that Universal Declaration, it's pretty sad to think that it took the Second World War. With the end of the war, creation, I'm quoting now, with the creation of the United Nations, the international community vowed never again to allow atrocities like those of that conflict to happen again. World leaders decided to complement the UN Charter with a roadmap to guarantee the rights of every individual everywhere. Now, was it easy? No, not at all. Came at a time of great polarization between East and West, communist and liberal ideologies. Again, quoting the Commission on Human Rights, was made up of 18 members from various political, cultural, and religious backgrounds. These included Eleanor Roosevelt of the United States, René Cassin of France, Charles Malik of Lebanon, and John Humphrey of Canada. Roosevelt recalled some of the challenges created by the diversity of this committee. She said, Dr. Chang was a pluralist and held forth in charming fashion on the proposition that there is more than one kind of ultimate reality. The declaration, he said, should reflect more than simply Western ideas, and Dr. Humphrey would have to be eclectic in his approach. His remark, though addressed to Dr. Humphrey, would have to be really directed at Dr. Malik, from whom it drew a prompt retort as he expounded at some length the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas. Dr. Humphrey joined enthusiastically into the discussion, and I remember that at one point Dr. Chang suggested that the Secretariat might well spend a few months studying the fundamentals of Confucianism. Well, it took about 2 years to compose the text and many more months of debate to adopt the document. But when it happened, those who participated were very aware that they were involved in something special. Hernan Santa Cruz of Chile, a member of the drafting subcommittee, wrote, I perceived clearly that I was participating in a truly significant historic event in which a consensus had been reached as to the supreme value of the human person. A value that did not originate in the decision of a worldly power, but rather in the fact of existing, which gave rise to the inalienable right to live free from want and oppression and to fully develop one's personality. In the great hall, there was an atmosphere of genuine solidarity and brotherhood among men and women from all latitudes, the like of which I have not seen again in any international setting. Well, I would suggest that something significant when the world adopted the UDHR and in subsequent international treaties and domestic legislation that followed, but it's not been enough, obviously. So again, what's it going to take today to bring about a renaissance of this kind of respect, one that can spread throughout the globe in the hearts and minds of people everywhere? Is the problem bad enough yet to motivate people in general to look for solutions? Maybe not, but I would say it's pretty bad. Perhaps the answer is partly the same as the necessarily inadequate answer that I provided to the Sierra Leone representative at the UN conference. It's not that people don't care, it's that they are unaware. They know some bad things are happening. I've just come from London, where you all know we've experienced the third terrorist attack in as many months, done perversely and wrongly in the name of religion. In late May, gunmen attacked a bus carrying Coptic Christians in Egypt on their way to prayer, killing at least 28 people. Also in Egypt, 2 suicide bombings at Palm Sunday services at churches on 9th of April left 46 people dead, and another suicide bombing in Cairo in December killed 29 people. Meanwhile, the Eritrean government has stepped up its campaign against Christians, arresting almost 100 in the past month. Around the same time, police arrested 22 people when a crowd of villagers vandalized a Catholic prayer hall in southern India. The building had just been consecrated the week before. 9 religious civilians were reportedly shot dead in the Philippines last week. Russia has recently seen, if not state-sponsored, at least state indifference to persecution against Jehovah's Witnesses and the Salvation Army. And in the United States, even this past week, we've seen religious prejudice and ignorance manifest at the highest levels, which I would say has been unprecedented in the last 50 years. This is perhaps not an auspicious omen. You'll note that this is not all about Islamic extremism, but that's certainly what's grabbing the headlines lately. It can't be ignored. But the results of that are that innocent Muslims are suffering unfairly in retaliation. In Manchester, peaceful Muslims are afraid of reprisals and a backlash following the recent terrorist attack in that city. According to Newsweek, many of the city's nearly 250,000 Muslims dread the seemingly inevitable backlash against their community. Mohammed Abdul Malik, an imam, says the aftermath of such attacks is a time marked by fear. I think with past experience that fear is there in our community, especially among women, he said. But the people who were killed are our colleagues, our friends, our neighbors as well. You cannot separate us or segregate us from the impact of such an act on the people of Manchester generally. So the situation is bad, but is it bad enough? Well, I think so. With today's capacities for communication, I don't think we need to wait for a cataclysm like a world war before we do something effective, and I'm hoping that the G20 can play a significant part in this. These kinds of attitudes will change only when there's been widespread delegitimization of the kinds of attitudes and ideologies that lead to violence. There have been past examples of such delegitimization in history, delegitimization of unhealthy attitudes, ranging from simple things like smoking cigarettes in the United States to ending state-protected slavery or Nazi fascism, privateering, and more. These are only done with the right cooperation of government, schools, media, interfaith coalitions, and peer and family resources. But interfaith respect too often falls victim to unfamiliarity and ignorance, fear based on that ignorance, and language that creates semantic divisions. Demystification of one another's traditions can only come with exposure to each other and some pretty hard intellectual work to get through the semantic mazes that have grown up with time and sometimes separate those of us of different faiths. I remember one time I was invited to a conference in Romania, and when I arrived there, we were about an hour and a half from the conference, and our host said, we're going to wait for everyone to get here from the airport, and that won't be for about another 6 hours. So you two who have already arrived, sit here and wait in this hotel. And it was a little hotel out in the middle of nowhere, and then we'll come back and get you this evening. So there we were in this lobby, this person who was a law professor from Liberty University in the United States, a very strong evangelical Protestant. And here was I from the law school at Brigham Young University, Mormon tradition, and evangelicals and Mormons haven't always seen eye to eye, I have to say. But there we were, stuck together. So we started talking, and we were both pretty open, I think, and pretty soon the discussion turned to religion. And after a while, we were just ironing things out. We were struggling with the terminology that each of us uses in our traditions. By the time we were done, he looked at me and said, you know, if everybody had this discussion and was able to get through these language barriers, I don't think there would be any tension between Baptists and Mormons. I believe he's right. Some people are afraid they'll lose their own convictions when engaging with others. I suppose there's some risk. I do have a friend once who, in frustration, we've been talking about religion late into the night, and then he finally said, don't you realize that if I believe what you've told me, it will turn my life upside down? And we don't want to become so culturally relativistic that we lose the fuel of our own convictions, that what that provides to do good things. I believe if we that we can learn to value what others value, and respect those things and still maintain some sense of our own convictions. Now, the last thing I want to do here, and I forgot to look at what time I started, but I do want to take a minute and go through this part. And I think you said we could go more than 12 minutes. You set a bad precedent for me. But,
Go ahead.
For the last couple of years, I've been teaching regularly a course at the Brigham Young University Centre in London called Religious Liberty in the British Isles. And as part of this course, I take my students around to mosques and synagogues and to a Hindu temple. I bring in speakers, Baha'i speakers, Church of England speakers, and so forth. Now, these students are pretty much mostly young Latter-day Saints, Mormons, if you will. Many of them have grown up in the state of Utah, where their religion has been a majority. And although they're good young people, they have of necessity are a little bit provincial sometimes when they come to us. So I take them here, and then I've asked them to do their own assessment. And I just copied some of the remarks I had from some of my students after we've made visits to these places. So let me just go through a few, and then if it starts going too long, I'll stop, but I want to catch some of these in their variety. Samantha, she said, recently Natalie and I were in a conversation discussing how a mutual friend went to an all Latter-day Saint elementary school. We discussed how this can be problematic due to a lack of exposure to other religions and belief systems. While here in London, I have benefited greatly in being exposed to other religions and visiting different religious sites. I have become less ignorant and have increased in my understanding of my own religion. This learning was particularly influenced by my visits to St. Matthew's Church, the Hindu Temple, and the East London Mosque. McCall, I've gained so much insight on the many different world religions and I have developed a great love and respect for them all. Mallory, pretty much any city outside of Utah County feels religiously diverse. When you live in Provo, Provo's the heart of Utah County and one of the most Mormon cities in the United States. But London is truly a melting pot of different religions and cultures. I notice myself viewing the world through a type of Mormon filter after being in Provo, assuming everyone around me is LDS. However, Mormons are definitely a minority in London, and that has really opened my eyes. My respect and appreciation for other religions has increased. And as a result, the love for my own religion has deepened. Rachel, we've been so blessed to have been able to visit so many religious sites on the study abroad. Through my encounters with other Christian denominations, Hindu and Islamic faiths, not only has my appreciation for them grown, but for my own church as well. As we learned more about the Hindu religion, I realized it was not so different from my own. We both have sacred places of worship and believe in loving all mankind, self-sacrifice, and loving God. Like Hindus, Muslims and Mormons have a lot in common, even to the point of believing in the same old prophets. Probably my favorite thing about Islam is the devotion it requires, and people really are that devoted. We've been persecuted in the past and still are to an extent. My own faith is strengthened when I stand up for the religious rights of others. Ultimately, living here in London has been one of the most eye-opening experiences of my life. It strengthened my convictions, increased my love and tolerance for others, and strengthened my resolve to stand up for others' rights. Brooklyn, I've grown up in some part of Utah my whole life. I consider it both a blessing and a curse. A blessing because I'm in the majority for religious belief, but that's also the curse. The Utah bubble is very real, and even though I've had the blessing to travel a lot, I was surprised when taking this course how little I really knew about other religions. One of my most memorable experiences was visiting the East London Mosque. I can honestly say that I was embarrassed by how little I knew and the prejudices I held. After walking around the mosque and learning more about the religion, I was surprised to learn that there were similarities to Christianity. This helped my own understanding of my religion grow because it allowed me to relate what I knew about the Bible and early Christianity to other religions to start to piece together where they all came from. I'm grateful I was able to see other examples of prayer to compare to my own and to appreciate the feeling of reverence that comes with it. Caitlin, on my way home from the East London Mosque, I was completely overwhelmed. How I had assumed my experience there was wrong on all accounts. In the wake of the recent terrorist attack and everything I had grown up assuming, I knew this experience was one that changed my life in just a matter of hours. Natalie, our visit to the Neasden Hindu Temple helped me make multiple ties between Hinduism and Mormonism. She goes on at some length, but she says, overall, my experiences in London have taught me that there are many amazing, faithful people of all religions out in the world. Chloe, having come from a home where not everyone in my family is a member of the LDS Church and attending a high school where I was the only member in a class of over 800 students, I've been exposed to and befriended many people of all religions. However, no previous experience can compare to what I've seen and heard in London. Talking to leaders and faithful followers of various faiths has not only increased my appreciation for other religions, but has strengthened my convictions, caused me to feel more gratitude for my own. She goes on in detail about how impressed she was by the vicar of St. Matthew's Parish of the Church of England, who gave up a career in the law because he felt a call from God to serve in the church. Seth, if our visits to the Church of England, Hindu Temple, and London Mosque taught me anything, it's that these religions teach good principles to their followers that benefit their society. I love and live my religion, and as a result, learning about religious freedom and defending it has become important to me. I will do all I can to learn more of these issues and preserve the religious liberty of all. I don't know, there's so many more that I can do. You're starting to get the idea that just a couple that address different traditions. When we were in the Jewish synagogue, I could feel the devotion of the people of this religion who have been persecuted for centuries because of their beliefs. I was grateful for the opportunity to learn more about Judaism because in turn it helped me better understand my own religion and especially the things I read in my own scriptures. Learning about and seeing things like significant Jewish holidays and symbolism in the synagogue gave more meaning to my study of the scriptures. Finally, here's one. When Kishan Manoj, Baha'i leader, came to speak to us, I was thrilled. I had never heard of the Baha'i faith before. This was completely new to me, but from the readings, I found myself very intrigued. I actually found myself agreeing with a lot of their principles, which surprised me. And then I guess I'll just end with this one. Jillian, in my life, I've had the opportunity to attend Jewish Shabbat, observe the Passover, celebrate Ramadan, attend Baptist, Catholic, Methodist, and Anglican services. I've read the Quran, Holy Bible, Tao Ching, Book of Mormon, and continue to find books of religious import to read. I have sat down with Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormon missionaries, been taught by a Methodist preacher, and sat to listen to a Baha'i and a Muslim explain their faith. Why would I, someone who is staunchly LDS, a returned Mormon missionary and firm believer in the doctrine of the LDS Church, do so? Because I know that God speaks to his children in any way that they will listen, and that I will grow closer to God by learning and accepting other religions instead of fearing them. Well, as you may imagine, I was more than a little gratified by seeing the responses that these young people had, and actually seeing it change their attitudes and the way they talked about other religions. I just returned a little over a week ago from taking students to Northern Ireland. While there, we sat down in Belfast with former members of the IRA and former Protestant paramilitaries who had served time in prison for their parts in the violence of the Troubles. We toured the peace walls of the city that still is somewhat divided, but working very seriously to overcome its differences. We sat with university professors who provided history and theory, visited a Republican museum and a Loyalist exhibition. We sat with a Methodist minister who was highly engaged in the peace process. Finally, we directed the discussion to the United States and asked, what can we learn from Northern Ireland to heal the rifts growing in our own country? Some of the students admitted following the trip that before they came to our program, they didn't even realize there was a difference between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. I'm sure you would agree there is some difference, right? Well, they now know. I think these accounts help show the changes we want to occur when we submit our own hearts and minds to the new experience that comes with exposure to others' faiths. It's a difficult process to clear our own souls and communities of prejudice. Exposure to one another is essential if we hope to move forward as a world. Can the G20 help make people aware so that they care? Certainly in the world of technology we have before us, there's a way for this exposure to occur without having to fly everyone to other countries. Let's hope the G20 will consider the possibilities. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David, for your presentation. Now, Fearghas.
Thank you very much. My name is Fearghas O'Bara, and originally from Ireland, living 20 years almost in Brussels, working in the European Parliament. And my current role in the European Parliament is to provide support for the Vice President of the Parliament, who is responsible for dialogue with faith groups, with churches, religions, and also with philosophical organizations. And there's a distinction to be drawn between interreligious dialogue, which is a matter for religions themselves, and dialogue with religions and with churches. The purpose of which is to discuss issues, discuss policies, discuss legislation, because there is a belief that they have something to contribute in that field. So I'll touch briefly on two of the points here, points 2 and 3, which are on your program in relation to the Interfaith Summit. And 2 being the constructive dialogue between leaders of multiple sectors in society, and in this particular case, between political leaders and religious leaders, but not just leaders, not just faith leaders, but also faiths in general, and a lot of the dialogue relates to faith actors on all different levels and on the ground. And secondly, also the point that's on your program of demystifying and fostering communication channels between different faiths. So Having said that the EU doesn't engage in interfaith dialogue, I would say that the EU can facilitate interfaith dialogue, because by virtue of the fact that you gather some faith leaders around a table to discuss a particular European issue or policy, these people are in the same room, which, as Professor Kirkham was indicating, 2 decades ago in Northern Ireland might not have been obvious to get people from very different backgrounds and traditions even in the same room. And that's something that can be done in a facilitating role. So just by way of example, the next seminar that we will hold in the European Parliament in a couple of weeks' time, on the 27th of June, is dealing with the future of Europe. So it's not an obviously religious or faith-based topic, and intentionally so, because the EU has gone through a series of crises, starting with the economic financial crises, and then the migration issue, and then terrorism, very, very actual issue, a lot of different things. And of course, Brexit offers or proposes a particular set of challenges to the EU, more challenges admittedly to the UK itself, but nevertheless there are some issues to be addressed on the EU level. And therefore the EU is currently going through a process of reflecting on what kind of union or community should be built going into the future, and different options are on the table, whether you want more Europe, less Europe, deeper Europe, just economic Europe, and so on. And this is something that we feel that we should do as wide a consultation as possible on. And of course, that includes faith communities. So there's an obvious reason for consulting with faith organizations, with churches and religions, because they are part of civil society. But it goes beyond that, and I think this is also found in the treaties themselves, in the preambles and so on, of defining the EU as much more than an economic union. It's not just a technical project. I mean, from the very beginning, it had much deeper meanings. It was essentially a peace project after the Second World War. It was about peace and reconciliation. Reconciliation itself is a transcendental concept. The idea of reconciling. It's not just rebuilding, which is very technical, but actually reconciling. The idea of forgiveness. So from the outset, there are some concepts that go beyond the technical. And at the heart of the European project, and again, you find it in the treaties and you find it in the Charter of Fundamental Rights, is the dignity of the human being. And it's essentially everything derives from that, constructing a Europe that's round about the human person at its core, and there to serve human dignity. And again, you referred earlier to Catholic social teaching. This is a concept derived from that, as are some of the other concepts that permeate the European project, such as subsidiarity. Taking decisions as close as possible to the people at the lowest, most effective level. So. The European treaties don't make as explicit as the US Constitution, where these values derive, or that there are these transcendental values, in the sense of the basics in the US Constitution are set out, and then we're told, and in also in the Declaration of Independence, about we hold these truths to be self-evident. And if something is self-evident, then it's not normative. It's something that's deriving from natural law, and can be found in each and every person by themselves. And so that sense is there, but in a less explicit way with the European treaties. And when in their last iteration, and the Lisbon Treaty, the Article 17 was put in, which is a legal basis for the work that I do. That was giving a more explicit recognition to that of the role of religion and faith in societies. And I would say that in terms of constructive dialogue with faith-based organizations, with churches and religions, well, essentially, there's pretty much every European policy can be discussed, because if I take the example of the largest member state of Germany, the largest private employer in Germany, so after any state-based organization, the largest private employer in Germany is Caritas, which is a Catholic Church network of charitable organizations. The second largest employer in Germany is Diakonia, which is a Protestant-based network of social and charitable works, everything from schools, hospitals, homeless, now more and more migration, and so on. And so you have a particular societal model there in Germany. Every single member state has a different history, and therefore this different church-state relationships. You have countries like the United Kingdom where you have a state church and so on. But in many, many cases, you have this recognition that a lot of policy on the ground is actually implemented by faith-based organizations. So it's a myth to say that you can separate religion from public policy. You cannot, and religious actors are often the ones implementing public policy. Most recently, I was just back from Germany. I was there for a couple of days the end of last week for something called the International Gathering, which is organized by the Bundestag and in the Bundestag, and bringing together senior political people from many, many developing countries, but there was also from a big contingent from the Western Balkans, including the president of Albania, with church organizations, faith-based organizations, and church representatives. And for instance, one workshop that they had there was looking at how to integrate the newly arrived migrants. And very practical projects are kind of being rolled out on the ground by faith-based organizations, like practical down to building the housing and building housing on university campuses, so that there's an organization there called Hoffnungsträger, Bearers of Hope, and how the students would then help with language lessons in exchange for cheaper accommodation, and they'd be living there with the migrant community, so this integration happening. And these are kind of faith-based initiatives. Give a second example, which is the president of Albania was accompanied by the full set of religious leaders of Albania. So Sunni Muslim, Bektashi Muslim, Orthodox, Catholic, and evangelical. And there they had also a workshop on talking about their own interreligious dialogue and their community relations, which are very good in a region like the Balkans that has had many wars based on ethnicity, identity, religious background. They've managed to avoid that with very good community relations in Albania. Indeed, there's only a very small Jewish community there, but they did have Jewish refugees from Italy during the war that were looked after and housed by Muslim families. So they've a long tradition of keeping their society together by these good community relations. And this is something that can be learned from and tapped into on the political level. So in a whole series of areas, from including some hardcore foreign policies, the role that religious actors can play is enormous, and that potential should be recognised. And then it can also be put back to them. I mean, in the discussion that I had with some of these religious leaders who are pushing very much unified for their country's accession to the European Union, I was asking them, well, and what will you contribute to the European Union as Albania, and to have them think on this, and then giving this example of community relations and helping within the Western Balkans, which has been a problem area, was something positive that they could think of. But then went on to say, yes, and we also campaign against corruption, and we, campaign for the establishment of European law, or of the rule of law within their, just from an ethical point of view, and teaching their congregation that certain things are unacceptable behaviour in public life and immoral and so on. So they come at it from a different perspective, but it can also be helpful. And I finish off with just one last little anecdote. I was recently in Washington for a series of meetings there, and looking at, and there's a lot we can learn also, and from the US context, of the role of faith based actors in public life and in foreign policy and so on. But I took up an invitation to go and speak at a small Christian college called Patrick Henry College out in Virginia, and evangelical Christian college. We had a discussion with the students and so on, and afterwards I went to speak to the president of the college, and he was asking me about, well, how are you dealing with all of this migration crisis in Europe? And I probably came with a certain prejudice that the right and the Christian right in America is some of the sounds that we've had from the United States have been, look, you Europeans, you're making a mess of things. What are you doing, letting all of these Muslims and migrants in and so on like that? And this president of Patrick Henry College told me that he brought a group of 20 students to Greece for a week. And they went and lived in the poorest quarter of Athens, and worked in refugee camps, with the migrants there, Syrians, Iraqis, and so on like that. And his approach was, when we look at this, we get a certain version of it from the media. I wanted to bring these students over there, see it for themselves, and get those students to ask, what would Jesus do in this situation? And then that they would go back and be ambassadors in their families, in their communities, and so on like that. And so it's just one small anecdote, one tiny example, but I think the interface between the political life, public life, and religion, faith-based organizations can be a very, very enriching one indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fearghas. Thank you all to all three of you for your insights and what you share, the personal experience and the concrete examples. Let me try to summarize this. This is always the hardest part for me at the end of each panel discussion. So, Pasquale, you highlighted rightly the link between freedom of religious belief and economic development, and how the two can mutually reinforce each other. And then you mentioned the importance of a strong civil society, and how it is even stronger when it comes with a bottom-up approach. David, you, in addition to your to the experiences of your students, which are very eye-opening, you also mentioned, you underlined the importance of the value in understanding others' beliefs, which in turn will strengthen individuals' convictions. So it's more of an open approach towards what is different, or what appears to be different, rather than building walls or being diffident. I actually can say that we noticed this as an office recently. We started live interviews with representatives of organizations and other faiths. A few weeks ago, we had representatives of the Baha'i community in Brussels. We interviewed her, and we had actually a very strong response by people online mentioning that for the first time they were learning about new faith, about faith that they didn't know before. They didn't know the aspects, and actually changed the perspective. And Fearghas, going back to your comments, thank you for sharing what the institutions do in terms of facilitating dialogue between, not between churches, but between churches and the institutions. But you're right. Based on my little experience here in Brussels, I did see how the dialogue with churches also facilitate, in a way, the relationships and the cooperation between churches themselves, and how this actually provides a fertile ground for good and positive initiatives, and also the role of churches within the fabric of society in terms of you brought the German examples with Caritas and Diaconia and all they do in terms of healthcare service and help to the needy. So I hope I did sum up somehow in an appropriate way what you said. And now the floor is open for questions and for your contributions. Please introduce yourself.
Good morning, Ethan Wilkinson from the Office of Nathan Gill, MEP. Just two questions. The first one to Professor Annicchino and then to Professor Kirkham. So the first question, you're saying that religious liberty and freedom is the responsibility of the state, and sometimes, more often than not, it's the state that kind of violates those freedoms. And something I've noticed working in this capacity is there are always reports of lists of the worst offenders, so kind of list those countries in which there is a lack or a big disregard for religious freedom and liberty. But I guess just a personal curiosity, I guess, maybe it's kind of a reflection of my own ignorance, maybe it's something I could do myself, but from your experience in academic research, taking into account the principles you outlined of economic development, freedom, strength of civil society, what, according to your knowledge, what are some best practice, best examples of those countries that that kind of display these attributes of religious liberty, economic development? We know, Thailand and Burma, these countries are some of the worst offenders, but kind of what countries should we be looking at for best practice and best examples? And then the question to Professor Kirkham, I think I've entirely destroyed your quote here, but something along the lines of, you said, understanding can only come with exposure or intellectual study to other religions, something along those lines. I think that is true only because of the situation in which we find ourselves now. I'm a firm believer that every single person is inherently good, and therefore exposure to other situations and intellectual study would not be necessary. But because of the experiences, and obviously not everyone, whether through socialization or ideology, is maybe displaying those inherently good attributes. So my question is you've outlined some of your students had these amazing opportunities to interact with other faiths and cultures. I think it would be fair to say that the sheer majority of people are either not willing or ever going to have such experiences of interreligious dialogue and fostering those communities. Like, I have never been to a mosque myself, whether that's because I've not wanted to or I'll never take the opportunity. I think it'd be fair to say the majority of people will never have that experience. So therefore, whose responsibility is it to ensure that there is interreligious dialogue and fostering those community relations? Is it the responsibility of religions? Is it the responsibility of government, education, personal citizens? Because I think looking at these recent attacks we've had in the UK, for example, the Prime Minister came out this week and said, enough is enough. We can no longer tolerate extremism. We may have to have potentially embarrassing conversations. And so, again, from my point of view, again, more empty rhetoric, a lot of words and no action. But what action is necessary? What kind of, me listening to that speech, what responsibility do I have? What responsibility does the Prime Minister have? Because I think at the moment, there are a lot of fingers being pointed and a lot of blame going at different people's doors. But I think most people would agree that substantial things have not been done. So what needs to be done? And so I guess that's the big question: is who has that responsibility? Thank you.
Shall we go?
Yeah, unless there are other questions that we may collect together.
Yeah, I have a question for Professor Kirkham. It's kind of similar to Mr. Wilkinson's question. It's specifically about the concept of demystification. In the United States, I've noticed there's been a lot of backlash against learning about different people's religions. I see Facebook posts all the time about mothers who are angry that their kids' teachers are trying to introduce their students to some basic tenets of Islam, which I personally would consider pertinent considering what's happening in the world right now, to educate the students into basic beliefs. But if demystification involves exposure and education, and there are people who are opposed to that simply because they think it infringes upon their own religious beliefs and they don't want to feel like another religion is being forced upon them or their children, how would we overcome that so that we can reach that level of demystifying and understanding one another?
Thank you. I think we can address these questions.
Shall I go first?
Yeah, please.
Thank you very much for your question. Let me add one thing. Statistically and historically, when we think at violators of religious freedom, as I said, we usually think at states. Today is not that statement is not totally true anymore, because among the worst violators of religious freedom and other rights are non-state actors. Think about ISIS, for instance, and many other groups like that. So the situation has become even more complex because in given territories, you don't even have states that violates rights and then that control the state. Now, research has been done on who are the best performing actors, and I mean the research that the Pew Forum, for instance, publishes every year. It's an example of that research. So there are countries like Brazil that usually score quite high in those rankings, and of course it's an institutional matter. So you need to have certain institutions and provision in place to respect core civil rights and religious freedom, but you also need to have a certain culture in place, and also the research that Professor Brett Sharp has done shows that certain countries perform better than others because of the culture that backs those institutions and those legal norms. And usually, for instance, Catholic countries score quite high in those rankings, also because Catholicism has gone through an internal reform, specifically on the topic of religious freedom. I mean, let's not forget that the Catholic Church not always accepted the very same principle of religious freedom, but over the years it has developed a doctrine on religious freedom and on the freedom of the Church that has then spread globally. Therefore, I mean, the data are available. There is room to improve the research there. I highly recommend you to look at this report from the Pew Forum, where you have all the statistics and the best performers in this particular field.
So those, the answer, the answers to those questions, of course, are not easy, and they're not short-term answers. But we say that sometimes, and then we excuse ourselves, and don't really try to solve them. So by saying that they're not easy, I'm not saying that there aren't answers and that there aren't solutions. I believe there are, and I do believe that at the end of World War II, the world saw an unusual. I mean, there was diversity still, and there was conflict, definitely still tension, but there was this unusual consensus that came about that created something like the United Nations. When my students get frustrated and say, why can't we reform the United Nations in a fundamental way, I will say, it's because things aren't bad enough yet, and so maybe you don't really want them to get that bad. But as I said in my comments, I don't think we have to wait for them to become as bad as they were for us to be able to make some significant changes. And that's mostly because of advancements in technology and communication. So when we have negative attitudes that fuel, for example, violent extremism, ideologies, and so forth, those attitudes need to be delegitimized and then replaced with something legitimate. And that takes time, and it takes intense cooperation, sometimes necessarily unstated cooperation across many facets of society. And so who has responsibility? Well, governments have partial responsibility, but can only be effective up to a certain point, because many of us, probably rightly, are skeptical about how much interference we want from governments in our own lives. Education is one of the most effective means, which again is tied to some extent to government. The media has a powerful influence on people. Now, if you have state-controlled media, it loses its impact because it's chalked up as propaganda, which it often is. So you have to have media that somehow finds itself in harmony with the general attitudes of encouraging interfaith cooperation and encouraging and demystifying the differences in faiths, and encouraging people to not be afraid of one another. I think one of the greatest insights I pulled out of all this work with my students was how some of them went in a little wary, but they trusted us when we said, look, it's okay to go to a mosque, or it's okay to go to a Hindu temple and see things that you've never seen before. And they came away, instead of saying, oh, now I want to become a Hindu, they came away saying, aren't the Hindus great? And now I realize my own convictions are pretty good because they're so much alike from all these other people. And we start to discover this core. We don't have to be afraid that we have to give up everything that we have brought to the table. But we, I think, come away with a greater sense, like Fearghas was talking about, that there is this individual human dignity, self-evident. We don't call it that today, but some kind of a natural law that I wish people would speak again more openly about. But the sense that we are more alike than we actually realize. Religious communities can play a strong role in this by just being willing to sit down with one another and show their own congregants. You don't have to be afraid of a Muslim. You don't have to be afraid of a Catholic or a Mormon. And then peers and families are going to have strong influence. So what we see, for example, when I do just because it's an easy one to show, I show my students the whole smoking thing in the United States and how it was legitimized in the 1950s through commercials that made people look so suave and sophisticated, or they even had children's cartoons, Fred Flintstone lighting up a Winston cigarette with his friend Barney. And that's how they were legitimizing the whole idea of smoking and making it seem fashionable and cool. And then after people started really realizing, well, whoa, this is killing people, it's taking its toll, there became a campaign in the opposite direction. And over time, cigarette smoking in the United States dropped dramatically over 20 years, 30 years. And so what has to happen for this demystification and for the mothers to not be afraid and so forth, somehow it has to become fashionable to be able to listen to people of different beliefs. It has to be legitimized at every level. And we have to stop telling our children, don't play with Johnny, he's of a different religion, and so forth. So that's a short answer to a very difficult question. We spend semesters on it, and we don't have all the answers, but I'm confident the answers are there.
Thank you, David. Fearghas, would you have anything to add to these responses to this question?
In terms of Ethan's comment about might be some difficult conversations that need to be had, and linking it to religious freedom. I mean, it's interesting to observe how, with all of these terrorist attacks taking place, in the West, and we know that far bigger and more deadly attacks have, take place on a very regular basis in Iraq and Syria and so on like that. But what is being attacked? It's like when you look at a city like London, a world city, which has a Muslim mayor. 5% of the British population, I believe from the latest census, about 5% is Muslim. apparently roughly 5% of the Saudi Arabian population is Christian. I mean, Saudi Arabia over the weekend has banned all flights from Qatar and accusing Qatar of fomenting terrorism and so on like that. There isn't, you know, a single church or house of Christian prayer permitted in the whole of Saudi Arabia. I mean, can you imagine the idea that you could have a Christian mayor of Riyadh? You know, so where I don't know, all of these different strands coming together, but I mean, religious freedom is something that is core to our identity in the West, and we have to defend that greatly. And when you have these kind of attacks, you have some backlash, that is true. But I've visited many mosques around the world on my travels, and have prayed in mosques, invited in, talked to the imam, and you know, you learn a lot. You get rid of some of your prejudices, but you also can be, as Professor Kirkham was saying, you know, be reinforced in your own beliefs, because you actually see, yes, what is in common, and also what is different. And we haven't always, perhaps in the West, been as strong on religious freedom, but it is certainly one of the core values that we need to defend very strongly now.
Thank you.
Could I add just one more sentence? I guess maybe I forgot to say one of the most important things for this particular gathering, and that is that when we say who has responsibility or who could be effective in the demystification process, I think the G20 Summit is a place to discuss these kinds of things and can go a long ways towards legitimizing healthy attitudes, delegitimizing unhealthy attitudes.
Thank you. This actually make me think. All of that has been said. One of the main points on the agenda, the German agenda for the G20 in Hamburg, according to the German website that they put up for this event, is the refugee, how to deal with the refugee crisis, displacement, shared responsibilities of countries, both countries of origin and countries that in the end are the recipients of these movements of people. How do you think the recent attacks in London and in Egypt and throughout the world may affect the attitude of those world leaders at this summit as they approach this issue? And how would you address that with them from a bottom-up approach, as we could say?
Who are you asking?
Well, to the panel.
I've already said a lot, but we're all waiting for someone else to answer this very difficult question, because it is a difficult thing, and I get just a little bit sad when I think about the fact that I think maybe the leaders aren't going to be too anxious to address this. That they're more inclined to try and wall themselves off as much as possible from the issue, and that's why we're seeing these movements throughout Europe and the United States of curtailing refugees, because people are afraid. They're not just afraid of different ways of life and thinking, they're afraid of economically, what's this going to mean, and this is going to mean crime and so on and so forth. The only way there will ever be a solution to those kinds of problems is to address them very honestly. So don't just, we can't just on the one hand say, no, we'll have nothing to do with refugees. But we also can't just say, oh, open our hearts if we're real Christians or real Muslims or Hindus or whatever. We, of course, will welcome all of these people. It has to be done methodically, intelligently, but absolutely respectfully, and in a way that hopefully will reach those who are the most desperate, in the most desperate need.
And just, I totally subscribe to all the things that David said. I just want to add that a conversation, because we are in Brussels, is also needed between European leaders, because there are countries that are not taking their responsibility for this. And speaking also as an Italian, I think that my country is doing much more compared to other countries economically and in terms of rescuing people. Now this is of course not because the Italians are better than other countries, but just because we are there, and from a moral point of view, you don't want to see 300, 400 people dying in the sea every day, because in any case, then you need to rescue them, and we are talking about children and pregnant women and so on. I mean, look at the Frontex report and look at all the available data. It's clear that in the system there are many things to fine-tune, just to use a soft word.
Thank you.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. There are many things to fine-tune, and as often is the case, in Europe, we wait and wait and wait, and until something becomes a crisis, and then realize, oh, we have a crisis, we have to deal with it. Whereas the precursors to this latest wave of migrants, they were obvious many years before. I mean, from the war situations, and from the first fleeing of the Iraqis and the Syrians first, they were waiting a long time in Turkey before they started moving from there. So one could have foreseen all of that. In fact, it's not even really perhaps fair to call it a crisis, in the sense of, if you are living in Lebanon or Jordan, you really have a crisis. You have a number of migrants. It's about 50% of your population. So when you get 40 million in Germany, and when you get 30 million in Italy, then maybe it's a crisis. And Jordan and Lebanon are nothing as wealthy as the West. So I think, yes, there's also the question of shared responsibility, and responsibility with obligations, and there are benefits from being in the European Union, but it wasn't perhaps explained what the obligations are as well. That, when you do have free movement within, then that means you have to have a common external border policy, and what the knock-on effects of that are. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I'm very interested to hear about the exchange arrangements with evangelicals and the Mormons sending folk to different countries to different religions. My suspicion is that this is something that can afford to be done in certain areas of Western society. How do you get the other movement of young Muslims, particularly those in more deprived social areas, being able to have the experience of mixing with Western ideas from other religions and seeing the advantage of that? What gets the impression there is this sort of ghetto mentality. Is there any good examples you can share?
I don't know a lot of specific examples that have taken on widespread, but I do think I've seen situations where societies that are predominantly one religion or another engage on something other than religion, and that's been effective. So it might be sports, or it might be common humanitarian projects, those kinds of things. So I think that's one area that needs to receive continued attention.
There is one successful European project, which is the Erasmus project, the project through which university students from one European country can go and study like 1 year in another European country. And some institutions try to replicate that. For instance, Italy is trying to replicate that with Tunisia, Morocco, Northern African countries, so that you allow the people that go to the university and study, that will be the elite of that country, to come and spend like 6 months, 1 year in Italy to study, and then the education that they get there will be recognized by their home country. So I think that a kind of a global scheme for Erasmus with also big Muslim countries should be try to be developed. So it says that you have a scheme like that with big Muslim like Indonesia and big countries where you allow European students to go spend one semester there. Think about the people that do Asian studies or study languages and so on, and then you allow students from there to come to Europe. That would be quite a beneficial program, I would say, to speak concretely.
One of the humanitarian organizations in Germany that was giving a presentation on a workshop on Syria, from their work and talking to many people of the refugees, what they concluded was that the main reason that people had decided to leave the refugee camps in Turkey and move on and to head particularly for Germany was to do with their children. And because if they had a preference, they would have gone back to Syria, back to Iraq. They had their home. They had, they didn't speak foreign languages. They didn't see a prospect of starting a new career, in a foreign country at that stage. But, once it goes beyond a certain amount of time in a refugee camp, you have to make a decision. You think, are we going to be here for 3, 4, 5 years? Will my children get any education? Will they be able to pick up again? And that's why, they went there. And in that sense, the most important thing is very quick integration into the system, so that those children, once they arrive in Germany or in Italy or wherever, are able to immediately get into the education system. And they are often then the key to the parents also integrating, because they're able to facilitate them. They pick up the language very quickly, and they're involved in sport activities, different things. And once apparently they go beyond 5 years in the host country, they're almost never going to return, because at that stage the children's education takes priority. They have to complete that education and so on. But it is also true that in all of these recent terror attacks that we've had, in Europe, they have not been related to the recent wave of migrants. Despite what some people in other parts of the world might be tweeting, this is not the cause of the terror attacks. But they are people who are British-born, or Belgian-born, or French-born, or whatever, sometimes second generation. And so there is definitely a problem there, but it's a problem of not integrating an earlier wave of migrants, and that has to be addressed. That's true, but it can't be put on the current refugees and migrants back.
So it looks like that all goes back to education, encouraging people of not being afraid of the difference, and as part of a larger integration approach. Any other question?
I have 2 questions. First of all, you talked about how religious freedom has a positive correlation on economic prosperity of the countries. Understanding why is that? What are the mechanisms in place that allows these countries to flourish and be better people than other countries that don't have as much religious freedom? I think it's important to understand the why for that question. My second question is, do you believe that religious freedom should extend to religions that teach its adherents to abhor the societies in which they are in and to revolt against it? Do you think there should be some restrictions in place to religions that are clearly having a negative impact on the societies in which they have, because of the teachings result in some of these claims to that?
Thank you very much. I will reply very quickly on both questions. First of all, as I said, there is in the studies that are emerging from demographists, from economists, from political science scholars, what they show so far, and again I refer and encourage you to read this article by Brigham on International Journal of Interdisciplinary Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion, is that it's not religious freedom alone that contributes, because religious freedom alone doesn't flourish when you have violation of other civil rights. But usually, when you have a strong bundle of civil rights protected, and religious freedom is one of them, that correlates positively with economic growth. And why it is so? It is so because a climate, and this is true historically, as I said before as well, when you have that institutional climate, you allow people and organization to flourish because people feel their basic liberties respected. Therefore, they can also focus on secular goals. Your second question is a very tough question, especially today. And first of all, it's a matter of definition. For instance, we should agree on defining what is a negative contribution to society, for instance, because we might disagree on that, as we might agree or disagree on what is a positive contribution to society. Having said that, it is clear that there are certain things which are bad for society, certain things which are criminal action, certain things which are hate speech under the law of certain countries. So I would not, so far, until now, make a specific difference for a given religion. I think that in that case, criminal law is there, and whether he is an atheist, or is he a Catholic believer, or is an Islamic believer, or is a Mormon believer, if you violate those laws that are in place, which are general law, you deserve to be prosecuted as any other citizen. So if you publicly incite to violence, doesn't matter if you are religious or if you are atheist, you are going to be prosecuted. So far I would stick with that kind of approach, just being basically the approach of Western countries, where we don't make a discrimination according to the religion to which somebody belongs to.
I would just reinforce that, I think. Even the most liberal regimes with regard to religious freedom recognize the need to place some limits on what we call religious freedom. And I don't think it can be said really much better than the way John Locke discussed it back in the 17th century, when he basically said governments have no power, should be given no power, inherently have no power over what people think and believe. And religions have no power over your life, your liberty, or life, liberty, or property. The worst that a religion can do to you, if you violate their rules, is excommunicate you, cut you off from the community. The worst that a government can do with regard to your beliefs is basically nothing. But if you commit crimes, as Pasquale said, that injure someone's life, jeopardizes their property or freedom, then the state can step in.
Thank you. Well, I think we are out of time at this point, but thank you very much for all of your questions, for your participation, and thank you for being here today with us. And I think it would be
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we look forward to further and future discussions, and I hope what we learned here today will be applied to the upcoming summit. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
If you think about it, probably that would be great. They have different cards with different